All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, February 1st of 2022. Happy February. Thanks for tuning into the stream here today. We've got some interesting questions on tap here. A couple questions about a minimum exposure and how that works setting before the build. Should be an interesting one there. I think we'll start with that particular question here because I think we'll get an opportunity to run a little bit of an experiment there because I don't exactly know how all that works. There is a couple questions about total lineup ownership, editing exposures, things like that. Rules of thumb. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. We'll dive a little bit more into that today. Some questions more about broader NBA strategy, cash games, contest selection kind of thing. A couple questions about unique fill, filters. So a few questions, I would say probably about a half dozen questions here overall. We should be able to probably rip through these pretty quick, at least to get started. So good day to get your questions into the queue here. Pop them into YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack early. Should be able to get to them pretty quickly here today. I know yesterday we had a busy stream. Definitely a lot of questions that I think were a little more broader. We definitely had to spend a little bit more time on those, but should be able to kind of move pretty quickly here today. So anyway, 7-game NBA slate on tap here tonight. Should be a fun one. I like that we've been getting these Tuesday slates that are a little busier. I know normally the Tuesday and Thursday slates have a few less games on them. So should be an interesting little slate here tonight. A little bit more of a convoluted late swap schedule than we had last night. Last night was probably the cleanest late swap schedule of the year, and there wasn't really actually a ton of news that broke after lock too. So I know there was some interesting conversation here in Slack last night about how, maybe we're not getting so much of an edge last night, which maybe was true. But it sure was nice to not have to overly sweat late swaps all night. I actually, after that last game's locked at about 6 o'clock here my time, I actually went out and did things last night. I actually was able to get away from the NBA late swap machine and actually knock out a couple errands. So that was a unique feeling, a welcome feeling here in NBA season. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into it. Again, I'm going to start with this question mostly just because it piqued my interest here. And now I'm not entirely sure how this works. So we're going to start with this question from Catalyst Joe. And let's get into it. So let me go ahead and get the app up as well, the most important part of the stream here. And Catalyst Joe said, if I do a minimum exposure, then tweak a projection on step 3, does that min exposure potentially go away? I realize some of my min exposure guys didn't make it to my final lineups and curious if that may be why. So the minimum exposure, on step 1 here. So let's do this. Let's take Giannis and let's just say 40%. To just test this out. So we're going to set min exposure 40% for Giannis, and let's build a bigger pool of lineups here. We might cut this off, but I want to start here. And we're just going to let this build because I don't want to say anything here and then find out I'm immediately wrong. So I'm going to just let this build and keep my mouth shut here in terms of predictions here. But I'm interested to see how this works because I have a sense of how this works here, of how these two things play together. But I am curious to see how this plays out. This is a good question. Every once in a while, get a question, of the way that some of these different ways that you can use SaberSim, different steps of each part of the process come together. And I don't always know. So I am definitely interested to see how this one works out. But anyway. We have, I mentioned a snowstorm coming in yesterday here. It should be hitting us here within the hour. We've got upgraded where I'm at overnight to expect about a foot of snow coming in here over the next 24 to 36 hours. So should be quite a storm coming in. I'm a little excited about it, if I'm going to be honest. But anyway, let's see. So obviously we get the Giannis exposure here as we expected. So what's interesting here, and this is kind of the first thing I wanted to see. So we do carry this number over. Catalyst Joe or just Joe. I think so. First of all, we can even if we were to bring down his projection now, right? Since this got carried over, he's not gonna drop below the 40%. So I would say, that's one good news here, or one reason to believe that, maybe that this is persistent. I would say if you came in here and cleared this out, though, at that point, it does kind of unlock him at that point. And he is going to now it's going to allow him to dynamically adjust exposure accordingly based on the way that you've adjusted a projection. So you may have, again, that reset exposure standard. I don't know, it's possible that, what happened here is I could see a workflow where you've set some exposures in before the build. You're going in here after the build and you're adjusting projections. Then maybe you're also adding some additional extra exposures just to see. And when you click reset exposures, it's worth noting that it's going to essentially clear out both of your exposures. It's going to clear out the exposures you set before the build and after the build here in step 3. I was just going to note here too, because I think this is kind of interesting, or at least maybe we can look at this, is if we expand up to that full pool of 1,500 here. So those exposures that you set pre-build are ultimately kind of honored at the full pool level. So essentially to guarantee that those exposures can be met on an individual subset of lineups, we actually set that rule for the entire pool. So an interesting factor here and worth kind of just noting overall that's the way that works. So Giannis gets a minimum exposure for the entire pool of 1,500 set at 40 because we set that in step 1. And he also, when viewing a set of 150, gets a minimum exposure of 40, assuming we don't go in and clear it out. So good question. A little experiment to run there. And let's keep it going. See a few other people have joined up into the stream here today. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. HC's here. Welcome. Toasted Tater says, smash that like button like tonight's NBA slate. I love that. Let's get after it tonight here. Had a decent little sweat going on last night in the night slate for a little while. Obviously, well, I guess maybe not obviously, eventually fell off. Those smaller 2-3 game night slates sometimes can just take a little bit of a swing of the projection in one direction or the other to drop quite a few spots. So, but anyway, let's keep it going. Couple questions from JSJR here. And I'm just going to knock both of these out. We'll do kind of these both side by side here. So the first one says, is there a specific number we should be aiming for when it comes to total lineup ownership in step 3? I covered this one yesterday a little bit, and I am actually just going to say no. There are rules of thumb that you can find out there that people will write. They may study the fadeaway, or in the case of the NFL, maybe probably not the mini max, maybe the milli maker, right? And you'll see these heuristics where people say, put your total lineup ownership between this, or put your total lineup ownership between that. I think there's a few problems with that. I think, and again, I covered this in more detail yesterday, so I'm going to go kind of quick here. But I think the two biggest problems with those kinds of things is they don't account for slate context. They also don't account for contest context. So the two things there, right? If you have a slate where there is a lot of spread out value, right, on a slate like tonight, for example, it is probably going to be beneficial to be more aggressive with your ownership, right? You probably should expect that you're going to have lower total lineup ownership if you were playing optimally, because the best plays on the slate in an objective sense aren't really that good. When the best overall projected play on the slate is 6.78 points per dollar at 3,500, right? Compare that to last night where we had multiple players projected for over 8, right, value. Or even Drummond, I think, was 11x, right? Those are spectacular plays. So on a slate like last night, even with a similar amount of games, it would make sense playing optimally to have a much higher ownership sum in your lineups than like tonight, where it's probably, at least until more value opens up, not going to make a lot of sense to build very heavily owned lineups, because there's not plays that are deserving of very heavily owned, not plays that are deserving of very heavy ownership. I think the ownership, the one other thing I'll note there, actually, first, before I move on, the one other thing that doesn't account for is context of the contest, right? You need to fade more ownership in larger field contests, because a 10% owned play in a 100-man contest is a very different meaning. That has a very different impact on how many lineups you have left to kind of overcome than if you're playing a 100,000 lineup contest, right? You need to fade ownership in general a little bit more the larger your contest gets. And we can see that that's represented in these sliders, right? One of the things that I love about the sliders overall, really, is that because they are back tested, right? They are driven by data. We can actually use them to check our assumptions about the way slates play, right? It's not as if It is not as if we have an assumption about the way you should strategize for different contest types, and then we applied the sliders to match. It's the other way around, right? We back tested these sliders and figured out what the optimal positions are for them. And then from there, we can help check what maybe our assumptions are about the way that DFS should be played. So you can see ownership fade comes up as contest gets bigger, right? So that's the other thing that I think those heuristics don't account for very well, right? Or I think they are, I think people will read something like that for a large field GPP and assume it can be applied to a single entry when in reality it really can't. And then finally, I think the reason that this type of analysis is popular, right? Like how much total lineup ownership should you have, is not because in a vacuum that's actually something that's useful to anybody. It's because those are the only tools that traditional optimizers have to deal with the ownership problem, right? The reason people want typically to know how much total lineup ownership they should have in their lineups is because that is one of, if not the only tool that most traditional optimizers can use to deal with ownership and get lineups that are less owned. SaberSim has a much more sophisticated approach to that already with the ownership fade slider, so I really don't think we need to worry about that. And you will see some diversity to your ownership sums here, right? I do still think it's interesting to look at. That's why it's been added to the app, right? There's diversity here, right? Why does there's a lineup that has an ownership sum of 90 and a lineup that has an ownership sum of 117 here that are essentially the exact same Saber score. And in fact, actually even essentially the exact same projected score, right? Why are these two lineups coming up with these very different ownerships, right? It's because there are other factors that play into a lineup, right? This lineup maybe has a little bit higher positive correlation, maybe, right? Like maybe a little bit of kind of a game stack going on here. Looks like maybe a little bit more positive correlation. Maybe this lineup just in the simulations has a little bit more, actually, excuse me. Maybe this lineup has a little bit more like, I don't even want to say min cash equity, but maybe a little bit more like top 5% equity, where this lineup has a little bit more top 1% or top 0.1% equity, right? And that's something that just the ownership sum doesn't really tell the story. So anyway, I'm going to leave that there because, again, I also covered this question yesterday. Don't want to repeat myself too much here, but short answer is I really wouldn't sweat this in terms of intentionally seeking out a particular number here. So, and then this is kind of interesting question. Is there a way to completely build our rosters without having any SaberSim input in step 3? Not really. I'm not entirely sure what this question's asking. I know there's other tools out there that will kind of allow you to just build a lineup in the app, right? Like literally basically do the process of hand building the lineup, but just add in players yourself. I mean, I've talked about ways that you can kind of get at that by, for example, setting your lineups to 1 and kind of slowly locking in your players, right? So maybe you lock in, you've already got Giannis in there. Maybe you lock in, who's a value play that wasn't popping here. Maybe you lock in Caleb Martin, right? You kind of slowly start building a lineup together, doing this kind of thing, right? But there is not a way to do this without SaberSim input. So also, I mean, let me know if I'm misunderstanding what you mean here. But yeah, so Gootsman says, let's see. Says, apologies if this has been asked before, but what is the best way, in your opinion, to add value to the sim in NBA? Or maybe a few ways that you have found effective? Interesting question there, especially the way this is written, right? Add value to the sim. This is a tricky one because I would say the best way to add, the best way, I think, to like add value and the biggest way to get an edge in NBA DFS, I'm sure my audience here, or those of you that watch this stream often, already know what I'm going to say. I would say is late swapping, right? I think that is probably the biggest factor, the biggest edge in NBA DFS in 2022 here. In terms of the best way to add value to the sim, it's interesting. I don't do a lot of that, to be completely honest. I don't do a lot of adjustments on a player projection level to kind of, tighten things up. I also don't even do, a lot of my process for baseball or for football is, pretty heavily focused on editing exposures and managing risk and things like that. And I don't do a lot of that in NBA either, mostly because, when news breaks, your exposures are going to change dramatically to different players when you late swap anyway. So I don't care too much about having a big approach to adjusting exposures in NBA. I would say this. I think, in general, my approach to NBA, and I think it surprises people, isn't to actually go in here and make a lot of adjustments. I think we have by far the strongest protection model in the industry. And I think we have the best late swap tool that is available that lets you late swap way more efficiently and effectively than other people. And I just feel like that gives me enough of an edge. But if you're interested in watching someone that does spend a little bit more time making adjustments, and I think adding a ton of value to the actual projections, I would go watch Max's video. He did a couple, there's actually now kind of a series of videos. So in our NBA course on our YouTube channel, right? We have this full course here for the NBA season, but Max came on and recorded a video an hour long talking about his NBA process. And Max spends a lot of time doing some pretty impressive research into team rotations and matchups and kind of where usage is going to go. And when there are players that are injured or off the court. And these are all things that the Sims take into account. But Max does a really good job kind of auditing this and figuring out, maybe this is a situation that's a little bit more variant than we think. Maybe it could go like this when, the Sims kind of think it could go like this. And I think there's just a lot of really powerful instruction in this video. So I'd watch this first to start. We actually then did a ask me anything or ask a daily fantasy pro anything. That was like 2 days after that video went out and people asked a bunch of questions. So I think this is a good follow-up to that. And then I had Max on last week. In this video on the most recent Office Hours live stream, Max came on last week and talked with me for about 30 minutes talking about his recent 250K win and how he applied the strategies that you see in this video into that win. And also, a couple new things that he's picked up on over the course of this season. So I would say, again, like my NBA DFS approach, and I think this surprises people when I say this on stream, does not have a huge focus in going in here and making a bunch of adjustments and trying to add a ton of value to projections or things like that. I feel like I get enough of my edge from playing, and for keeping things relatively stock here and late swapping aggressively. But especially, Max is playing sometimes at high stakes single entry where you're going to be playing against fields of people who are going to late swap. Your edge that you are getting from late swapping is going to be a little bit smaller. So one of the ways that he adds a ton of value and kind of gets there and makes a difference is by, really diving into some of these rotations. So again, I think it's interesting just because of the way this question is presented. Right. And I may be reading into it too far, but it says, what's the best way to add value to the Sims? And to me, that inherently reads as like, how can I adjust projections? Right. And for that, I think this is the perfect video here. Right. If you are more broadly speaking of how you can do better at NBA DFS, I think there are a lot of other videos in here as well, especially this 4 keys to beating NBA DFS video that will help. But assuming that, this question is to be taken literally of adding value to the Sims, I'd go watch Max's video about how to kind of study rotations, study injury situations, and make adjustments. So, quick question from JSJR. He asked, what does it mean when this turns green when you bump a player? Green just means higher than our default value. Red means lower than our default value. That's all it means. So. And then JR729 said, I'm trying to build my bankroll and started incorporating more cash. However, I found more success running with lineups throughout the night and not late swapping. Is late swapping still a good idea in cash? Late swapping is crucial in cash. I think if you found that you've been more successful with the original lineup over not late swapping over even a couple weeks, I think you're probably just kind of getting lucky. Late swapping is crucial in cash games. In terms of, cash games are 90% contest selection. The game of cash is 90% seeking out the weakest opponents that you can find in the lobby. The lineup construction component of cash is like 5% of the equation and is by far mostly centered around packing as many projected points as you can under a certain salary cap. There's an argument to be made that there is a little bit of an ownership game theory stance of playing a little bit higher owned players. There are certain slates where it makes sense to prioritize a player playing in a late game if they would open up significant value in that situation if they were ruled out, for example, like a questionable player. I think there's an argument to be made that you can sometimes justify sacrificing just a little bit of average projection to get a higher overall floor. But those are all kind of advanced strategies that I don't think are necessary or represent a big part of your edge in cash. I think one of the most important things you can be doing in cash games, in NBA in particular, is late swapping every single time news breaks to see if there's a new way to pack more projected points in under the optimal. If you are doing that, very important is to make sure that you are actually using the cash game settings, right? Specifically, style set to cash in here. And that's true when you are building and when you are late swapping. So, I mean, just to be clear, you can get a different lineup building like this than if you build like this, right? So the cash builder, the way the cash builder works is we use a much slower optimization method that makes sure that we are building you the highest overall projected lineup. Since in GPPs, we're not really overall that concerned with making sure that the top lineup actually is the highest projected score. And we're building a lot more lineups normally. We use a faster method that kind of makes some sacrifices there. So if you built like this, especially on a large slate, you could potentially not get the best overall projected lineup. And it probably doesn't matter so much at lock, but when you're late swapping, right, it could potentially, I think, maybe not be giving you the optimal. It's unlikely, and it's unlikely to make a big difference, but really just make sure you're going in here and selecting cash. With all that said, yes, you need to be late swapping in NBA cash games, 100%. Your opponents are almost certainly doing it. So there's often important news. I'll say the same thing I always say about late swap in NBA, right? News breaks often. It is extremely impactful when it breaks, and the field isn't reacting to it optimally. That is why it is an edge. I think sometimes I mix those up or say those in different orders, but that's basically the trifecta of why late swap is so important. And that's true in GPPs and that's true in cash. So, Andrew asked an interesting question about some unique fill entry editor nuance that I actually had to reach out and ask Andy about. So, he said, if I unique fill 520 max contests with 40 lineups, for example, will the entry editor safeguard one contest from getting the same lineup twice, as long as there are enough contests for that not to happen? So the answer to this is yes. It will avoid. So even in this particular situation, right, it will avoid duplicating the same lineup within a given contest, but it will certainly duplicate the same lineup amongst your contests, right? Like what you're basically saying is I have 40 unique lineups and I just kind of want to pick a random set of 20 for each of my, this is actually basically what will happen. You're basically saying pick a random set of 20 lineups of my 40 5 different times and use that set into 5 different contests. So that's basically how it will happen. So, but good question. And I had to ask about that one. So, Toasted Taters asks another interesting question here. And this one is actually just a bug, but we'll read it. Running on Android mobile, was wondering if there's a way to have 2 filters. Default for NBA slate is always to include players where projection is greater than 15. Any way I can add an additional filter? Can't seem to find an add filter button. That is a bug. It is recorded on our end. We'll get that fixed. No, that's a little bit annoying for now. But this button, unfortunately, does not show up when you're on your phone. In fact, this page is kind of just hard to use on your phone, from what I've noticed. So I think we'll get the button added, and we'll probably do a little bit of cleanup here as well, because I think this page is a little hard to use on your phone. So, all right, let's see. Kobe asks an interesting question here, or an interesting timed question, I should say, because he said, "Hey Jordan, can you run through how to use SaberSim for prop betting?" And as of today, actually, we are kind of really transitioning how we approach the prop betting product with SaberSim. So in the past, we had a prop betting calculator. You could go in and plug in your odds, not even your sports book, plug in your odds, plug in the stat, plug in the player, and we'd basically tell you if it was a good bet, or you'd give us the line actually and the odds, and then we tell you if it was a good bet. I know there were some of you out there that really liked the prop betting calculator. We felt like the unfortunate reality was that it wasn't very useful to anybody actually trying to use it very manually, right? It was almost a little bit backwards, right? I think a strong prop betting tool would kind of help you find softer lines, right? Or poorly set lines on these bets, and then kind of give you a way to attack those. And it wasn't really feasible in a manual way to use the prop betting calculator to kind of go out and get all of that information for, on a 7-game slate, right? There might be like 500 different bets, even 500 different profitable bets across like multiple different sports books or something like that. So we are transitioning the prop betting tool at SaberSim to a kind of more picks-based model where we have automated a lot of the work on the prop betting calculator on our side, and we are finding up to 10 bets that we think are particularly soft for that day of NBA. This is not a wide release yet that is available to everybody. We are kind of doing a closed beta trial period of this. If you are interested in getting on the wait list to join this, DM Ross in SaberSim Slack. So DM SaberSim Ross, and he will add you to the wait list. So we are kind of trialing this. This is probably going to be what our new model looks like. I think the other problem with the prop betting calculator is that without, total oversight, it could theoretically recommend sometimes a huge bet, a 5-unit bet on a bet that we wouldn't necessarily make ourselves for one reason or another. So this gives us a little bit more ability to kind of track things and make sure that, what the experience that people are getting from the bets that we are recommending is positive. With that said, in the meantime, I think, I've heard users having a decent amount of success, especially on even money bets, just kind of using the DFS projections as a guideline, right? If you could get minus 110 on either side on a Nikola Jokic 12.5 rebounds, right? I think it's probably pretty obvious that it's profitable on the over there without the prop betting calculator. You may have to do kind of like a Kelly criterion calculation for yourself as best you can. And I don't even know if you could do that easily to determine how big of a bet to make there if you were precisely using Kelly or something like that. But I still think you could use that in the meantime. But we are pretty excited about this new prop betting kind of tool service that we are going to be offering here, I guess is a better way to say it. So I would definitely, if you're interested in that side of things, I would shoot Ross a DM and get on the wait list there. So Pat the Hat, let's take a look at this one. And then this is the last question in YouTube chat, or excuse me, in Slack, and then we'll jump over to YouTube chat. So I see you guys firing away your questions over there. We'll get to you soon. He says, is there a way to lock in lineups before tinkering with projections / exposures in step 3? For instance, if I'm making 20 lineups and I see 5 in the first 20 that I really love, is there a way to set aside those 5, but then play with the settings to get the other 15 lineups independently? Is it simply easier to do a separate build to get the other 15 lineups? If that's the case, is there a way to merge 2 sets of lineups into one group of 20? Interesting question here. Okay, this is a good one. The reality is at the moment, there's not a very clean way to do this. I think there are ways to do this. So let's look at this here. So I'm going to start by saying this. At the moment, there's not really an easy way to go through a build, for example, and say, these are the lineups I want and add them to this pool. You can kind of do that, and I'll show you how we'll do that in a second. But let's say, for example, then you wanted to follow that up by doing a separate build and add more lineups to that set or something like that. There's not a very easy way to do that right now, and we're kind of aware of the fact that there isn't a very easy way to do that. In the future, we would love to give you the option to basically say, send this lineup to that set of lineups and just put it in there, right? Maybe you just, I can even imagine a situation where maybe you're building and you're doing your single entry lineups and you see a lineup that you don't end up wanting to enter in your single entry, but you love the lineup and you want it to be in your 150 max, right? So maybe you want to do that. And that we're aware of that kind of hole there. And that's something that we want to add. In the meantime, I think there's a couple options. I think there's things you can do. So, specifically looking at this exact question, right? What I think would be the easiest thing to do would be to instead set your number of lineups to 1 here, and instead work from your pool. And I will do this sometimes if I on the right slate, right? Instead of going through and just managing exposures for my overall lineups, I'll kind of have more of a hand picking approach, right? So you said there were 5 lineups in your first 20 that you liked. So, I'm just going to kind of be random here, but maybe these are your 5 and you're kind of clicking them in and they're coming, you can see they're coming out of your pool and going into your set of lineups. Oh, actually, okay, this is annoying. So there's also a bug right now, which I think should be fixed probably in the next day or two. That instead of clicking lineups into your pool, they go to trash. So what we'll do here is we'll then go to trash and then just click include all. And now they're going to show up over here. So another annoying piece there. And I apologize for that, but you can see now they're kind of getting checked in here. So, there's your 5. And if you had another 15 elsewhere that you wanted to kind of add in and basically hand build a set of 20, you could do it this way as well. With that said, you are kind of limited all to doing this all within one build at the moment. There is still no way, we can say, check this lineup into this set of lineups, but there's no way to check a lineup and say, add this to this lineup set at the moment. I think our goal is to add something like that in the future, but that is the easiest way to do that for now. So, but all right, let's jump up. Question from M. Jackson. Is it advisable to have 100% exposure to one player? The sim often gives 100% player, which is a big risk if the player busts, but I'm wary of making too many changes and negating the sim's magic. This is ultimately going to be more about your own risk tolerance than anything, right? So the main guiding principle that's going to kind of determine how much exposure you have to different players in your pool is the sim variance setting. The higher this slider is, right, the more diversity you are likely to have in your pool. And this is something that's going to be adjusted based on the contest you tell us you're playing, right? So in a 3 max, right, this is what I mean about this being contest specific. In a 3 max, you're likely to have multiple people that are 100% owned in your build, right? In 150 max, you're probably quite a bit less likely to have that, right? And you can audit this. You can do some testing and actually see that this is true. So it is going to vary quite a bit on a contest by contest basis. On a single entry, obviously, you have to be 100% exposed to everybody in that lineup. With that said, there's nothing wrong with making an adjustment here, right? So let's run a quick 20 lineup build and see what we're getting out of this here. It's going to depend a lot on the slate too. Last night, I think it was very likely that you got a lot of 100% owned players because Drummond was projected for 10x or 11x. Isaiah Jackson was also like 9x. I think there were other value plays that just were spectacularly projected. And when there are very good plays, when there are players that have a 90% chance, right, their 10th percentile is still 5x output or something like that. Like we had players like that last night. It's almost impossible not to fade. But even here, you see tonight, right, we're getting 100% exposure to some of these better projected. Oh, I still had that Giannis exposure set there. We're still getting, pretty good exposure to some of these better projected plays on the slate, right? Now, there is nothing wrong with saying this is too much risk for me, right? I am not willing to be all 100% invested into Dinwiddie and Towns. How much exposure you want to drop that to is ultimately up to you. You might say, if Towns is truly going to be 11% owned, I don't need 90 percentage points of leverage on him. I might even drop this down to 50%, right? Maybe Dinwiddie's going to be a little bit higher owned, so we want to look a little bit more leverage there. And maybe we put him at 75%, right? So again, reading this question back here, is it advisable to have 100% exposure to one player? There's certainly nothing wrong with it. I would say, in 20 lineups, I have 100% exposure to at least one player on most slates for NBA, I would say. It is more often than not that I have exposure to at least one player, right? But no, there's nothing wrong with saying that's too much risk for you personally to assume in your lineups. And, there are players that in a 3 lineup set might say it's too much risk to assume to have all 3 lineups have one player in them, right? There are also people that build 150 lineups and say that they want 3 different players in all 150, right? There are pro DFS players who do that. So this is less about improving the expected value of your lineups. This is less about strategy, and this is more about risk tolerance. I think it would also depend on how much bankroll you were investing, right? If you're playing 5% plus of your bankroll on a night-to-night basis, and you feel like this is too much exposure, I think that's probably fine. And if you said that you wanted to lock 4 players into your lineup every single night and build 150, then I would say maybe you should be playing, less than 2%, 1% of your bankroll so that you can deal with that level of variance. But absolutely fine to adjust that. So, cool. Aaron said, would you max the NBA Yahoo no management fee 25-cent contest or just stick to the 1% entry rule? Let's look at it. Let's take a look. I didn't know this was here. Whoa. I didn't know they had no management fee contest tonight. Cool. I've been playing the golf one. And here's your answer of what I've been doing. Oh, it filled. Yeah, these fill fast. I'm still sticking to my 1% rule. I think if you're gonna play, they're not gonna let you. Oh no, this is a 10 max. Let's see, what's this one? This is a 30 max. So again, they're not gonna let you play more than 30% of the entries or 3% of the entries in the contest, right? I don't know. This is such a little tiny contest that I would probably just say, like, you might as well max it. It doesn't make a huge difference. Adhering strictly to my principles on these kinds of things, I think I would probably still just play 10 lineups, like here on this one, for example. In fact, that's what I think I'm probably going to do. I'm probably going to put 10 lineups in this. Even actually, I should say this is a 10 max. Even if this was a 30 max, I would probably still do the same thing. I feel like I am overly competing with myself when I fill up an additional 2% of the total lineups in the contest, right? You start taking win equity away from yourself, especially in these smaller fields. So that would be my approach. But if you're ever going to pick a contest to pay more than 1% of the lineups in the contest, it would probably be something that has no management fee, because you're not really losing as much then in that case. From there's, these contests that are raked at 16%, where so much of the prize pool goes to first, right? Those are the contests where, from a theoretical standpoint, you really feel the difference of playing each of those additional lineups. In these contests where the payout structure is really flat and you're not paying rake, right? There's still a lot of equity, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, in these lower payout positions, that it can make sense to play more lineups. So I wouldn't talk you out of it if you wanted to do it, but for me, I'm going to probably go enter 10 lineups. And even if I was playing this one, which is actually the true 30 max, I might just skip this one. I don't know if $25 has me overly excited, but this is decent. So Brad says, just started brand new to SaberSim yesterday. So first of all, thank you for what you guys provide. However, what is the recommendation for a rookie? I have no idea where to begin or what adjustments I should make, aside from running the optimizer and adjusting for the particular contest I'm in. Well, first of all, welcome, Brad. And I'm glad you found office hours here. I think as often as you can get into office hours, I'd recommend coming in here, asking any questions you have as you continue to get familiar. I'll point you in the direction of a couple resources here. So the first is in our support documentation, right? So that's just support.sabersim.com. If you come in here and type help, I made this article primarily for this exact reason. So I don't know if you can read it. It's a little small on the screen, but it says, I'm building NBA DFS lineups and I'm totally lost. Help. This is like a very short little video that I made, 15 minutes long. So not too bad. That kind of gives you the basics of, like, here's what you need to know about building your first lineups with SaberSim. So I'd start there. Once you get familiar and it's not like, I have no idea what's going on, you kind of start to get the idea of what's going on. That's when I branch over to our YouTube channel and start to watch some of our content here. And we have it all organized by sport. So if you've been playing NBA, right, we have this NBA course that is like 12 hours long. There's a lot of content here. You can kind of slowly work your way through it. That'll kind of help you put the pieces together. So this first one is all about contest selection, which is a huge overlooked part of DFS. Then, the 4 keys to beating NBA DFS, like broader GPP strategy, a video on late swap, cash games, showdowns, etc. These kind of bridge the gap between not just DFS or not just how to use SaberSim, but also some DFS strategy. That is where I would start. So, but somebody is reminding me that I need to drink some water, and I don't have any. Whoops, forgot to grab it today. So we'll tough this one out. But thank you for looking out for me, Toasted Taters. Appreciate that. Let's see. Oh, water special delivery. Do a water break here. All right. Good call. All right. Cool. Let's keep it going. Let's see. Edward says, in the late swap, and okay. So it sounds like Edward is kind of asking here, if you're playing cash and also GPPs and things like that, how do you late swap, right? So let's talk about that. So we have lineups here. Let's get an entry file in here. I think I have got some like random contests here for tonight for the main slate. Okay. So kind of a little spread of different contests. I've been branching out a little bit in some of the lower stake stuff, playing some of these winner take alls and things like that. So anyway, let's go ahead. Let's fill these. And let's download these. So I always talk about, for my process, it's much easier to just late swap everything together, right? I always say that, typically I'll go in, I will group all of my lineups together and I will late swap them together. That is only for just GPPs. If you are playing different contest types, I think you should be late swapping those separately. Late swapping your GPPs and satellites, if you're playing satellites together, I think is fine because those aren't going to play too differently. But if you are playing cash games, you absolutely need to be late swapping those separately. And fortunately, we make it very easy for you. So I don't have any cash games in my pool, but that's okay. We can pretend I do. So let's say that these were cash games, right? Just as an example. So this filter up here will separate your contests out by type. So if you were playing, if this was your mix, 66 GPPs and 4 cash games, you should absolutely be swapping these differently. And the way I would do this is I would go to cash first. I would click swap. I would click late swap. In this case, I have 2 lineups. I think 90% of the time, probably 99% of the time, this will actually just say 1. And you'd go in here and click cash and then late swap, right? So then you would get this build. This would be your late swap build for your cash lineups. You would download this. You would upload it to DraftKings or FanDuel or whatever. Then you would go back to the entry editor. And now you can see conveniently as well. Well, let's give it a second to update. Oh, actually, okay. So I am confusing the entry editor because those 2 lineups are not actually cash games, and the entry editor knows that, so it's getting confused. But you can see those 2 lineups have now updated to say that they were filled with the late swap build, right? So let's just so we can be consistent here, say that those are still cash, right? Then we would go to the GPP lineups and swap only the GPP lineups. And now we need the GPP settings, and we use this, and we swap like that, right? So again, like GPP and satellite, they're going to be a little different. Satellites in general, you play a little riskier, but they're close enough that if you wanted to swap those together, I think that's fine to me. Cash, you absolutely need to be doing separate swap because the cash, the way the optimal strategy for cash is very different than GPPs. So. All right. Mitchell said, is it necessary to late swap before every unchecked unlock game starts or just when a player is out? Kind of in between those two, right? I don't think it's necessary to swap for every single game start if nothing has changed. But I also don't think it's not necessarily the only situation you want to late swap is when a player gets ruled out. Right. In NBA, sometimes a player that was not expected to be starting going into the starting lineup is enough reason to late swap. Right. Especially if that player is a little bit chalky or if there's other chalky players in the starting lineup. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a player that's out. Right. But I also don't think if we got the exact starting lineup we expected and no news broke in any of the games in a certain late swap window, you could probably get away with not swapping. So I'm sure you're like, well, Jordan, how do I know then if I need to swap? There's a couple tools at your disposal. The first is in our NBA Sim Alerts channel in Slack, the same channel that says we're re-simming this game. That's also plugged into the Underdog NBA Twitter account. So you can kind of see, you can kind of follow the news, right? Like if a sim is just running randomly, sometimes it's just like a minor minutes projection in one direction or the other, right? But if a Underdog tweet comes out that says, here's the starting lineup, and then the sim runs, right? That might mean something was different about that starting lineup, or a player is out and then the sim runs, right? That's definitely something you want to take into account. The one other resource that I use religiously is the Basketball Monster Player News tab. So on Basketball Monster, under this news tab, they will kind of just show you all of this news here as it comes out. And this can be really useful, right? Like maybe it's after lock and Orlando and Chicago, right? So it's 7:00 Mountain Time here, right? We have no real, it appears we have no pending news about this game, right? It looks like Javonte Green's going to play, right? Maybe the starting lineups come out there exactly as we expect. But then let's say like 15 minutes before lock, a sim runs, and you're like, do I need to swap for that? Well, you could come in here, and maybe you come in here and it says that Cole Anthony is out because he has a stomachache, right? Whoa, that's a big news, right? The Underdog would probably tweet that too. But then okay, I'm going to need to swap because that sim ran, right? So I think you can use this. You can use the Sim Alerts channel. You can kind of piece it together if it actually makes sense to swap. If you're ever unsure, just do it because it doesn't hurt anything doing it, right? Like even if sims are running and even if it is just minor adjustments one direction or the other, in theory, that might give you a little bit of an edge too. So don't ever don't stop yourself from late swapping. Don't look for reasons not to late swap, right? Look for reasons to late swap and set a low bar for what a good reason to late swap is. That's what I do. And honestly, if I'm in a situation where I'm like, I see sims are running, it's 6:00. I don't really know what's going on. I'm away from my computer. I'm on my phone. I don't have time to, check, did something happen in these games? I will just swap. Because the worst thing that's going to happen is you're just going to get a little bit of a reshuffling of your lineups with no news breaking. The best thing that's going to happen is you didn't realize that Cole Anthony's stomach hurt, and now that he's not starting, and Jalen Suggs is the best value play on the slate, something like that. So, but good question. Yoga Club. Sorry if I'm late to office hours, but have you discussed the duplicate lineups in cash and how we can avoid it in FanDuel? Yoga Club says, the sim is amazing, but if we were all at the pay line, then we split the payout and it's hard to cash. Yeah, that's that. So that's kind of a problem in general with duplicates in cash games. I think, like for all projection models, right? You have this kind of problem of like, we're all going to get the same optimal. I don't think especially with our kind of general stance about cash games at SaberSim, is I don't think you're going to run into huge SaberSim trains in your cash games in general. And I guess more precisely, I don't think it is worth sacrificing projected points off of your lineup to avoid it, right? Like to get away from that lineup, you could pick the second best lineup if you want, purely just to try to differentiate yourself a little bit, right? Like the second best lineup is likely to be, maybe a half of a point less. But these things matter and they add up quickly. Like even a projection point of difference in cash games is an edge. It's a significant edge. You are taking like a step down by playing a lineup that is just slightly less projected in cash games, even in that case. So I think if you're concerned about it, potentially, you could pick maybe like one lineup down, but let's see. Let's do this. Barely touch these projections at all to see these lineups, right? So, the top lineup is 317.3. Okay, so actually, no, this is a really good example, right? Let's see. Are these the actual? Yeah, no. So this is a really good example, right? I would never, ever willingly drop four projected points of raw projection to get this lineup that is for like maybe theoretically less duplicated ever. I is sacrificing far too much for me. So I wouldn't go and do that. And honestly, if you're playing cash games and you're finding that your lineup, like I haven't played cash in a while, I don't think there's a huge edge in NBA cash so much anymore. But when I was playing cash more regularly, the first thing I would do is kind of go in and, hope that I was very heavily duplicated, right? Like that's kind of almost what you want. Or you look at your player ownerships and you want all of those guys to be extremely highly owned, because that means that, the field kind of had a consensus sense of agreement of what the best plays on the slate were. If you have really low owned plays in your lineup, or you have an extremely unique lineup in a cash games, that generally means you made a mistake. Even if your projections are super tight for that night, and even if you win, right, it's probably more that you kind of just got lucky, because it's unlikely that this entire field of relatively sharp players using a set of projections and optimizing would have gotten a completely different lineup than you did. So, I guess, to wrap this one up, I wouldn't sacrifice a ton of projected points to try to do something different if it's super close, right? If these two lineups were even this, I wouldn't sacrifice a full point probably. I'm trying to find a good example. Maybe if these were the top two lineups and, and you were concerned about duplication, right? Then maybe you do that. But again, like all it ultimately ends up affecting is if you're right on that cash line anyway. And at least then you have equity, right? Like you have equity in the win position. Let me put it this way, right? Let's say these projections are precise, right? That we know for a fact that on average, this lineup scores 0.2 more fantasy points on average than this lineup. Then taking this lineup instead of this one, purely to lower your chance of being duplicated and share prizes around the cash line, is basically opting into a coin flip of who's going to win all of that prize money. And it's a coin flip that you are actually theoretically going to lose more often than not in the long run. So it is actually to your financial advantage to just accept whatever. Actually, I'm kind of changing my mind about this. It is really to your financial advantage basically to essentially just ignore duplication completely in cash, assuming that you are confident in your projection model, because willingly accepting any lower projection here is going to probably be a losing proposition for you in the long term. Now, willingly accepted a little bit of a lower projection to get late swap flexibility, or to get a lineup that is maybe higher owned, right? More likely to be duplicated. There's a different argument there, right? Because there's a game theory argument and there's a strategic argument there. But purely to avoid getting duplicated so that you don't see shared prizes at the end of your 50-50 or double up, I don't think it adds anything for you. So, and if it does, it's like pennies on the dollar there. But I think it's actually to your disadvantage. But anyway. Brad says, again, and I think, okay, yeah, he said ignore this comment again. So cool. Tyrell said, is it better to run a new build before lock or refresh one's already created? Just curious. Always rebuild. Always. And the main reason why is because when you rebuild, we're going to build you a big pool of 500 or so lineups, right? And then find the best 20 from those, right? So you get this opportunity of the builder has this opportunity to kind of check its work and say, okay, I built all these 500. Now I get an opportunity to check and find what the best 20 are. If you just go in to an old build and just click refresh, you're taking this old pool of 500, right? With old projections, outdated projections, and basically telling the builder, with what you know now, what are the best 20. But the best 20 of a very old pool of 500 probably can't match up at all to a new build, a new complete build. So I would always, if you have the time, always do a full rebuild. So, let's see. With James Harden questionable, and also the last game, how would you go by building lineups to get him if he's playable tonight? When is his game? So his game is the last one on the night. So if we go into lock and Harden is questionable, it looks like he's probable here. So it looks like he's actually likely to play. But we have a couple other questionable players on Phoenix. I think this is an interesting slate to maybe create some late swap flexibility for yourself. Actually, maybe not. Well, here we go. What happened? Oh, so the entire Golden State Warriors are not playing tonight, pretty much. So here's our value. All right. So this makes it kind of interesting. So I'll say a couple things on this. When we started the stream, there was no value on the slate. There was very little value on the slate. If that were still the case, I think this would absolutely be a slate where I think it would be interesting to go in and look at some of these questionable or even probable players, right? We've seen Harden get downgraded throughout the day, right? In this game, and maybe bump up your projections to players playing in this game here, right? On the chance that, on a slate with very little value, right? So just to be clear, what I'm talking about, I would be like talking about doing something like this, right? Bump all these guys so that in case Crowder or Harden or Ayton or all these guys get ruled out, it doesn't actually look like we're projecting Ayton at the moment. Are we? I don't see him. But anyway, in case these guys get ruled out, right, we have the ability to swap into these better plays, right? But now there's a ton of value on the slate, and there's like spectacular value on the slate. So I don't know if I'm as eager to do that. I guess specifically in the Harden example now, like I would probably just assume Harden's going to play and like swap if we need to, if he doesn't, right? Harden's actually probably going to be pretty chalky now too, I would think, just because you can, well, maybe not. He's not projected very well, but it's so easy to pay up for him now. But anyway, long story short, now that there's like this insane value for the Warriors, I don't know if I'm going to be rushing to try to create late swap flexibility for the final game on the slate because we already have the value. If it was like, this is spectacular value. I mean, this is just insanely well projected value. If a couple, if maybe like, let's say just Curry got ruled out, right? The value wouldn't be as good as this, like the entire Warriors team getting ruled out like we got here. If that was the case, then I think it might still be interesting to maybe make a play on bumping some of the Nets or Suns to say basically, since both of these are the late games on the slate, to say, worst case scenario, you get to 6:30, your lineups are doing good. It looks like all these guys are going to play, and you reset projections, late swap, and swap back into some of the Warriors' value. Best case is that a big chunk of players get ruled out in this game, and you get the opportunity to swap out of Warriors' value and get some lower owned value playing in this game, right? And I think that would be interesting if this wasn't just such spectacularly projected value. Like, this is like what we had last night with Drummond. This is almost unfadable, right? This is kind of what I meant, right? Where, we don't show a 10th percentile, but we can kind of go look at it, right? It's 1, 2, 3. Gary Payton's 10th percentile is probably roughly like 21 fantasy points, right? That's like 6x. That's how good of a play he is. It's virtually unfadable. So I don't know if I'm going to be rushing to go do that. So. D Baker, how does SaberSim account for DVP? Interesting question. I don't believe that it is something that is explicitly accounted for in the model. It's something that I may have to check with Matt here, that I don't think that in our testing that is something that we think is very predictive in terms of predicting fantasy point output. I would say it's kind of implicitly accounted for in our model because of the fact that we are simulating games out play by play, right? So as we're simulating out each play of the Nuggets and Timberwolves game, for example, right? That is actually like a game by game or a play by play cadence in each sim, right? So as we have an understanding of the post defenses of each individual team and how well the teams match up against bigs in there as Jokic and Towns are kind of, going at it in that individual game sim, right? Based on our historical understanding and our historical understanding of the way these teams play. The reason I think you see DVP more consistently applied, for example, when you're looking at average projections, is because it won't necessarily account for that as naturally, right? You may project a player on average, right? Like what they are expected to do on average in that particular game, against the opposing team and given the matchups and things like that. But since you're not simulating the game, you don't actually have that same effect of like what is this player, how is this player actually going to play basketball on the court, right? All you're doing is trying to just create a number that represents that, right? I was kind of mentioning this yesterday a little bit too, where, again, most projection models out there, most DFS tools out there are just obsessed with this number. Everything they do is ultimately ended up creating this number, or ultimately ended up, like, the goal of it is to get here. And for us, this is just a representation of a much broader set of information, right? This is the information that we are striving to get. This number is just a way of looking at that data. So how is DVP taken into account? When I say it's not explicitly taken into account, I mean that it's not something that I don't believe it's not something that we're like actually like collecting and kind of hard coding or forcing into the model as like a multiplier, but it is something because of the fact we have a sense of, how good a team is defensively and how that's going to affect the play-by-play simulations that we write for a game. But it's not a, I think on other tools, you might see that, a player is bumped up or down as some kind of flat multiplier to their average projection based on the perception of how that team matches up defensively. And we don't do that here. At least that's kind of my understanding. I think I may reach out to, Matt or Will or Eric or one of the guys that maybe is a little bit more familiar with the model and see if there's anything that they can add on to that. Because that's a good question on the model side there. But hopefully that kind of helped cover that a little bit here. So, again, I think it's interesting, with some exceptions, a lot of these kinds of questions where it's like, there may be some particular stat or some tool, right, that kind of exists in the DFS space or the sports space that you may say, how does SaberSim take into account this? And in reality, all of this is taken into account somewhat holistically, whereas on, I think, a lot of other models, things are taken into account more kind of iteratively. In other words, what you see with the traditional NBA model or really just projection model in general is you'll have some raw flat projection that says, like, unadjusted for all factors. Essentially, this is this player's raw projection based on their historical rates and minutes is probably all you have, and maybe like Vegas. And then potentially based on the model, you might start making adjustments based on various different things, right? You could have DVP. Potentially, you could have like maybe a pace of play adjustment. There are certain models out there that are going to take into account certain narratives and maybe make adjustments there. You might have adjustments, for there's a wide variety of different things. And in that way, it's somewhat iteratively, right? Where you would have the raw projection and you would add in factor one, right? It's almost like you're making like a stew, and you put in the ingredients one by one by one by one. Right? With the simulations, we have an understanding of overall the full set of things that we think is important in the way that we predict the outcome of a basketball game. And then the sim runs taking those things into account and kind of also accounting for the natural variance there. So it's less so like we have the sim and we're like, okay, now add the DVP in, does that make sense? And instead it's, these things are all taken care of kind of in a more holistic manner. And that doesn't mean we're perfect. That doesn't mean we get everything right. We're improving the models all the time, but it's less about kind of, like factoring the thing in to the raw projection. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit of a tangent, and maybe a little bit, sometimes I go on these little rants here on stream, and then by the time I get the opportunity to listen to the stream back, I'm like, man, I should have shut my mouth 5 minutes ago. So hopefully it's not the case here, but I think, kind of interesting to talk about this a little bit more. And the model guys have such a more articulate way of speaking about some of these things on the simulation side, because they're the ones that are actually building it. But hopefully I'm kind of doing justice here to my understanding of this. Maybe I'll hop off stream and will come back to me and be like, dude, you're out of your mind. What are you talking about? But I don't think that's going to happen. So anyway, but that's all the questions I had for today. At least that's what it looks like. Yep. Those are all the questions I had for today. So we'll go ahead. We'll cap it off there. We're right at about an hour. Thank you to everybody that tuned in. It was a fun stream today. Talked about all kinds of different topics. Big thank you and a big welcome to a few of our new users. I know we had some new users here in stream today. So I will say we do this stream, or I do this stream every Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, same time, same place. So come back again tomorrow. Enjoy using SaberSim for your DFS lineups tonight. Let me know how it goes. And if you have questions, come see me here tomorrow and fire away. But until then, good luck tonight in your contests. Have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you tomorrow. All right. See ya.